And with the people that are here first. By the way, I don't hear anything. Could somebody speak?
Hello?
Yeah, okay.
Muted, that's
Great.
why.
Wonderful. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I just was wondering whether you were watching somebody's lips move and still sitting in a vacuum. Thank you. So is Gianluca here? So now, okay. Unfortunately, we might come back to Jean's question then. Next is Boris Zickel, and Boris said and told me in advance that he wouldn't be able to be at this, but he asked if I would answer the question anyway. So anybody want to give me a thumbs down or on that, or you want me to answer your questions first? Okay, here we go. Boris, we're all in favor of your getting your questions answers. Says, okay, is it possible to say that the experience of the still point and that of the equanimity factor in the fourth jhana are of the same nature, quality? Well, no, okay, that is an interesting question. Let's see, is the other related to that? No, it's on a different subject. So on the one hand, of course, equanimity is equanimity, but it can come about in a variety of ways. It can be, I think the right word wouldn't be stronger, but rather more robust or less robust. In other words, there are states of equanimity that are more fragile. So something a bit too emotionally charged or whatever can cause that equanimity to fail. So it varies in the intensity, and it also varies in the different ways of inducing a state of equanimity. And that does have something to do also with how robust that state of equanimity is. So the the state of equanimity in the fourth jhana it's dependent to a large degree upon being in that flow state. And I hypothesize, I know what it feels like subjectively in jhana and in all flow states. And I hypothesize that the way that the equanimity of jhana, well, let's not talk about the equanimity yet, that the flow state of jhana is induced basically by the mind somehow temporarily shutting down or blocking access to consciousness or something. All those parts of the mind that are not required to be active during the flow state. So, you know, a surgeon's in a flow state, for example, or a baseball player. Same thing with a meditator. If a meditator's in a flow state, it's achieved by somehow, there's some neural mechanism. It's a universal thing. Everybody enters into flow states all the time. They're a wonderful, wonderful thing our brain does. And a flow state in meditation is the jhana. So in terms of the equanimity that arises as a result of fourth jhana, it's a result of your brain exhibiting this particular kind of behavior that minimizes anything that will interrupt the flow state. And obviously, in the fourth jhana, that's going to include most kinds of stimuli that are likely to basically disrupt the flow state. I mean, it's no different than juggling, right? Your mind, your brain is juggling, right? And you enter in the flow state of the jhana. So you can achieve a wonderful state of equanimity there. It's a powerful state. Fourth jhana, you could do so many things in. But the equanimity of fourth jhana is dependent upon a set of causes and conditions that can't be sustained when you leave the flow state. It may be sustained to some degree or another. So that's a flow state that passes away. The interesting thing about the still point, it's the same thing, that when you get to that still point in your meditation, you enjoy a kind of equanimity. Now, in this case, it's more a just going into an almost pure metacognitive awareness. You're aware of everything that's going on, but that awareness is in a place that is total stillness, right? And that is something that your mind can learn to do, and it can be a great assist in, there's equanimity that comes from samatha, and there's equanimity that comes from vipassana. And the practicing the still point, as a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that has something to do with the fact that realizing the witness and that it just kind of comes automatically out of the flow state, is that it teaches your mind, brain, whichever way you want to look at it, to enter into a state of equanimity that's not really dependent upon anything the same way the flow state is. It is not in itself very robust. And so as long as you're in the state of meditation, there's tremendous equanimity associated with the flow state of the still point. But nevertheless, when you come out of the still point, that equanimity will fade. Now, there's a difference, though. It wasn't dependent upon creating a flow state. This equanimity was achieved in a different way, which, if I were to hypothesize about it, it's reducing the sense of self to such a, it really consists of very little other than a point of view. It's an agencyless, actionless point of observation, and it gives rise to a strong state of equanimity that your mind can learn to do, and it's a part of the equanimity that's going to arise as a result of unification of mind and everything else. So they're different. That's how these two are different in their origins and their long-term, their origins. And there is a time factor in here, but what it really is their robustness. How long the equanimity can survive the flow state or the still point before something comes along that's sufficient to penetrate that equanimity. And because the practicing the still point actually cultivates that ability, so it becomes more robust over time. It's a very, very powerful practice. It's essentially, I'd say, the central practice leading to the witness state in Advaita Vedanta. So there are some differences between these equanimities, and I hope that satisfies Boris. Does anybody have any questions that come to mind as a result of this? Yes, Katiana, good to see you.
I wrote actually the question in your message box, but I can read it to you. So what would you say are the causes of obstruction in
Sorry, I'm not hearing it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can now. Yes.
What are the causes of obstruction in the flow state from Theravadin perspective?
Oh, well, now that's a good question. There we have to do a little translating, I guess, from I think what we're doing here is applying the psychology of flow states to jhana. And so what we have to understand is that the word absorption, which is key to jhana, the word absorption can denote that kind of complete single-pointed or exclusive attention that we associate with entering jhana. But there can be lesser degrees of absorption too, which you experience, for example, in stage 7, you don't have that kind of effortless stability that you will at stage 8. But
would you think that a non-dual touching on the non-dualistic is and having a dualistic outlook in perceptual reality is the main reason for obstruction in the flow state, and that when we are in those deep states of absorption, whether it's in jhana state or even in just whatever our practice is, that that we can access that through letting go of that dualistic perception.
Well, that was a big question. Yeah, I'm having a little.
There's no. I can wait another time.
Okay, so you're asking about obstructions to jhana, obstructions to flow state. Maybe if I understood what you're trying to get at more specifically, I could give you a better answer.
Well, I often hear this phrase, obstruction, and
yes.
You couched it in terms of flow states, and from what I've understood of it, it's this state. We go beyond what is our dualistic kind of perception of reality.
Yes, yes.
I didn't know. I think that's what you were alluding to, or how you would define, in a sense, flow state.
No, that is one of the characteristics of a flow state, and it's one that it's very common outside of meditation. So of course, it is one of the characteristics of jhana as well. Is that yes, it's the sense of self is enormously reduced, right? So in a typical flow state, even in meditation, but outside of meditation as well, but even in meditation, it's the same way that Csikszentmihalyi, I don't know if I pronounced his name right, describes it. It's that it's as if it's doing itself, and you're kind of like in the still point. All you are is the observer, and it's doing itself. So the attention is remaining focused in the first jhana on your meditation object. The awareness is open and all-encompassing. There's the presence of joy and so on and so forth. But there's nobody there's no sense of anybody doing anything. There's just a sense of the awareness in there. So that's what you're referring to, right? Yeah. And
well, I mean, were you talking? Did you just say Chiksan, the Zen master? Was that the story? Did you say Chiksan?
no, I didn't. No.
Csikszentmihalyi.
Okay.
Said what? Yeah.
Csikszentmihalyi, right?
Oh, Csikszentmihalyi. Yeah. He's the positive psychologist who first brought the flow state to everybody's attention as a phenomenon. Yeah. So it's part of his. You'll find it in the book, in the chapter where I discuss on stage 6, where I'm talking about flow states there, and I quote from Csikszentmihalyi the qualities of it, and one of them is the sense that there is no agent that's doing it, and then this becomes particularly pronounced in the jhanas, and that's the wonderful thing about jhanas. Also, the limited thing about them is, you can see what it's like to just experiencing things happening, and you can experience your mind happening, but nobody's doing anything. As a matter of fact, if that arises, it will break the jhana, which it sometimes does in the less deep jhanas. So,
Thank you.
in the deeper jhanas, it doesn't arise at all. There's no sense of it. So, this is related to Boris' question about the similarities and differences of the still point, and I was talking about flow as far as jhana goes, right? Yeah. The still point is not a flow state in that kind of sense of some mechanism that's blocking things from disturbing the flow state. It's
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, it's different in nature. I'm not sure what the obstruction part was referring to, but okay. Let's look at Boris' next question here. Can physical pliancy come gradually? And he says, I am now able to sit for 1 hour with blissful comfort, which is quite new for me, but then I lose it. Is it still a manifestation of physical pliancy? And will it be extending gradually, or it only counts when one can sit for hours? And the answer to this is yes, it can come gradually. And of course it counts before you can sit for hours. But usually when you're really sitting in this place of pacification, and you've arrived at it through the progressive process, then most of the time it's not going to take very long before this is where you sit every time. At least certainly this is the way I experienced it. Now I know for some people, though, that it seems to be, you can be in this nice state of pacification, comfortable, all of the description, you have just the light, perhaps the sound, and your body has this wonderful light, almost ephemeral sensation to it, but you can't sustain it, and then you go back, you reach that place multiple times. But what was my experience, and from what I can tell, is, I'd say more commonly, the situation is that you approach the flow state, not the flow state, I still got that in my head. You approach the state of complete pacification, and then it falls away. When you finally reach that state of complete pacification, it still might only last the first time it happens for say a couple of hours, but you're probably already going to have been sitting for an hour anyway. What you find subsequently is it's much, much easier to get into a state of complete pacification. You'll go through PT. There will be, of course, some sits where you don't get there at all, but it becomes more the case that let's think of it as a skill. It's basically what it is. You're training. Well, no, it's not really a skill. You're training the mind to use the skills that it has in a particular way. And so it's the kind of training, there's some things that you progressively get better step by step, but then there's some things that you get the hang of it. And once you've got the hang of it, then it's just a question of refining it. And so my answer to Boris is that can happen both ways. And just for you, my experience of it, and I think a more common experience of it. Now, some of you have been through this, and you can say, I'd be happy to hear from you what your experience was of reaching physical pliancy. But I know with me that once I'd achieved physical pliancy, then my experience was more likely to be with most sits, is that I would find it really difficult to end the sit when I intended to. My timer would go off, and it was just so wonderful to be there that it took something a little extra to convince myself that I should really break that bliss of physical pliancy and get up. So, anybody would like to share their experience of entering into physical pliancy, and whether it was incremental or more of a you get the hang of it and then you just get better at it from that point? I see Katyana's face. Your box is highlighted, but you don't seem to be saying anything. Anybody else? No? Okay. So I think we've answered Boris' question. Is Michelle here today? Hey, Michelle. Hi. Oh, I recognize you. Good to see you again. Let's see. Michelle is asking us, she says, there is the understanding of the emptiness of self and impermanence. At times there can be brief moments of knowing that arises and passes away. The knowing itself arises and passes away, yeah. I am wondering how to work with this, and maybe the idea that there is something to be worked with is a hindrance in itself. Okay, so the understanding of emptiness of self and impermanence, and this brief moments of just knowing that. So these are what I would refer to as insight experiences. And an insight experience becomes an insight when it becomes a new way that you tend to see things most of the time. And it gets stronger. And part of the maturation, if what you're seeing right now is emptiness and impermanence, then that is also going to bring an awareness of interconnectedness. It's going to bring not just the emptiness of self, but the emptiness of all formations. As a matter of fact, usually the emptiness of formations comes before the sense of emptiness of self. That's usually sort of the culmination thing, but you can get tastes of it. But more often it's some aspect of emptiness or impermanence, or another gateway insight is suffering. And Yeah, so you can have insight into dukkha. Yeah. What else would you like me to say about that? You want to know how to work with it. Oh, very important point. Okay, thanks. I can't hear you. Let's see, you'll have to unmute yourself or get somebody to unmute you. Still can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Hey, I can hear you now. It's wonderful. Okay.
So it's almost like the mind gets extremely still, so there are no thoughts. And in that moment is where the knowing occurs.
Right.
And it's more occurring pretty consistently throughout the day.
Yeah.
But then the mind interjects and like, oh, there's got to be something to work with here. And sometimes I think the hindrance is just not letting go and allowing for the knowing to kind of permeate everything.
I would agree with you. It is, and I would view the hindrance as being those parts of the mind that have not realized that insight. So, and especially if you're talking about emptiness of self, but impermanence, say that the real insight into impermanence is realizing there's nothing but change. Of course, is that what we're talking about?
That's where I'm at.
Okay, there's just process, there's just flow. There are no things.
Exactly.
Okay, and so that's really the emptiness of phenomenon. You realize your mind is making things out of process, right? Right. So, the best way to work with this is there's parts of your mind that grasp this, and when when those parts of your mind are unified, and there's not too many other parts of the mind that haven't realized this, then you are, well, when you have that experience, that still place, and you're really experiencing impermanence, then what happens is that other parts of your mind, they share in that experience. So when it becomes conscious, it becomes available to those parts of the mind. So this is how that's an insight into impermanence becomes spread. Now, what you can do to help that is this experience will pass, and basically those parts of the mind that are constituting the conscious you, the whatever this part of you is that happens to be conscious at that time, has not primarily gotten the insight into impermanence, doesn't see things as change, but you can call it up again at those times. Okay, you can recollect what that experience was like. You can see that the way that everything was just flow and process. You can recall that, and you can see you're now looking at something and you're saying, it looks like it's just stable and unchanging, but it's changing in ways that I can't see, and it's just that it's changing in such a way that my mind only sees it as a fixed object, but it's not really that. So you bring that understanding into those other moments, and what you're doing is you're helping enough of your mind to reach the critical point of understanding impermanence that it becomes the way you see things most of the time. In the process of this, you'll have realized, there will be both impermanence and there will be the emptiness of formations. There's also going to be the recognition that all of this is one single flow. So you're going to realize the causal interconnectedness of everything. I mean, that's why there's nothing but change, because everything is constantly affecting everything else. So you have this pure process of change taking place, that your mind is projecting objects onto out of the flow, and that you can see that it's all part of a larger causal whole, that that it couldn't be any other way, and the only way that your mind could work in the world is by imposing this image. Eventually, that will come to those realizations will come to be applied to the self. So the self is empty. It's just a construction of the mind. It's even empty in a different sense than, say, when you see a table out of what you know is just a process that's not changing and rapidly enough to be obvious to you. But you'll realize that it's empty, that it's a process, that it's something that's arising due to causes and conditions, and that it really doesn't have any kind of substance to itself. Now, suffering is the insight that comes into this, can come into this process in a very disturbing way if your mind is not prepared. But if your mind is appropriately prepared, you essentially, the knowledge or insight into suffering is the realization that the suffering itself is empty, in the sense that it's something that your mind is creating in resistance to what is, in resistance to impermanence and emptiness and interconnectedness and everything else like this. And so it may be associated with a feeling as though you're, like jumping off of a cliff or something like that, right? But it's like you jump off the cliff and you discover you're flying, sort of thing. But it can come more gradually and more painfully as well. We're sort of kind of talking about one extreme. The other extreme is somebody where there is so much of the whole mind system is clinging so tightly to the sense of self, and one of the things that reinforces a sense of self is this is the craving, is the belief that pleasure can be obtained and that pain can be avoided, right? Yeah. So in somebody that has had the experience of that joy and pleasure are something that the mind creates already. I mean, they've already had a practical experience of the emptiness of suffering. But somebody that hasn't had that, somebody who still has a lot of self-clinging, and they still have a lot of craving, that their practice hasn't really done anything to diminish that, then this sense of self is its basic function is to protect us from death, right? And so without this kind of preparation, this kind of background, then the person can react in a lot of the ways that people do when they're confronted with the immediate prospect of their own death, except that you just have to keep on going, right? Yeah. And so and so these people can be extended for quite some time. It's going to trigger every buried. No, unfortunately, it's not going to trigger everyone, but it's going to trigger a lot of the buried neurosis and things like that. It's all going to come up as a part of this fear of death, this fear of irreparable loss, this realization that there's nothing to grasp to, everything, it all becomes terrible. Whereas seeing everything right now, when you see everything as being changed, it's probably a wow, isn't that cool? I really can experience this. It doesn't look that way anymore when there's a part of your mind trying to find something to hold on to,
Yeah, and what I'm experiencing is in sits, I was spending a lot of time in the moment between the arising and passing, and exploring that. And I found that has transferred into time off the cushion. And physical pliancy has been off the cushion. Everything's now coming off the cushion. So sometimes it's comfortable, yes, and sometimes it's like walking in two different worlds. So I think that might be where some of the clinging is just allowing it to be this way from now on. And that's how do you work with that?
Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. That is part of the process you have to go through. It becomes easier, Kajiana probably will like this, but really we could think of what's happening as a series of realizations of non-dualities. We begin with non-duality of self and other, the non-duality of mind and matter. These are the easier ones. Eventually comes the non-duality of being and non-being, which reduces craving and self-clinging and everything to, it just basically renders them meaningless.
Well, that's how it feels. It's like there's nothing left to hold on to, and it's just allowing it. So that's why I wondered if thinking there was something to work with was the hindrance to just allow it.
Yeah. Yes. But you can encourage it by when insight is not as strong or when it's not there, bring it to mind. Bring that insight into the present moment. You may not experience that, but you have the recollection of it, and sometimes that will be enough to produce the experience of the insight as well. And as the insights collectively mature, you're on the way. You're on the path. You're amazing. You're an amazing meditator. I was really impressed with you when you were with us at the Stronghold. But yeah.
You may be confusing me with somebody. I haven't been at Stronghold yet.
Oh, you haven't? Maybe I am confusing you with someone else. Okay. Yes. You remind me of someone else, and she was. I think her name's Michelle as well, and she was just amazing. She did a retreat, and she just went through the stages like magic almost. It was quite impressive. It was just a few months ago. So.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, so I'm not going to get through very many questions at this rate, but yes. William's here, right? My good. Oh, yes, there he is. I see you hidden in front of a pile of books. Okay, good. Okay. So, sorry for all this moving back and forth. For the past few years, I've been aware of feeling vibrations throughout various parts of my body when I'm not meditating. These vibratory sensations are most prominent in my feet, hands, but also felt throughout my extremities and trunk. They become most prominent when I'm sitting, standing still, or lying down. For many years, I've also felt a sort of burning sensation at the tips of my fingers, sometimes when I start to urinate. These sensations are different from the piti that I experience, sometimes as sort of showers or locally in my head, back, or throughout my body. Sensation of piti is like tingling or bubbles bursting. The sensations that are aroused with yawning and sneezing are very similar to the tingling during meditation. Actually, that is a really good analogy. That's a really good thing to compare it to. Everybody knows what that feeling. You have a big yawn and just sort of a spreading, tingling feeling. Yes, I know what you're talking about exactly. My question is, what should I do with the sensations when I'm not meditating? Should I continue to put my awareness of breathing at the nose and just keep these sensations in peripheral awareness? So this is, you're asking about not meditating, and maybe, I don't want to get lost on this part of the question here. So you're not meditating and you have these sensations. Should you continue to put your awareness of breathing out the nose? Do you mean attention? And are you talking about something that is already been going on? Yeah, just help me out a little bit here.
Right. I'm talking about where I'm just sitting and feeling the sensations, but I'm not sure if should be just paying attention to them or what I should do, if there's anything to do with them.
Well, no, there's the main thing to do is just to allow them to be there in awareness and be as aware of them as you can. There's nothing wrong with exploring the sensations with your attention, and as a matter of fact, it's probably pretty hard not to do that, because they have an interest and appeal. They're unusual, and also they tend in general to be pleasant, right? So
they can be unpleasant sometimes because they may be so strong.
Yes, right.
And they just have certain different vibratory elements to them. I mean, some that like the bubbly kind can be incredibly peaceful and incredibly soothing. Others, especially like at night, can be coming on so strong I almost have to change position to try to defacilitate them.
Yes. So my advice is to let them be there, and primarily it's just allowing them to be there and having a very strong, clear awareness. If you're not already in a state of powerful mindfulness, sort of a sampajana kind of mindfulness, that's a really good reminder to enter into that state. Let the physical sensations be there. Observe your mind's reaction to the physical sensations. Observe the Vedana of pleasant or unpleasant, and notice how when they become intense, it perhaps goes from being more on the sukha side to the dukkha side, and that sort of thing. That's what you want.
That also arose in me, that idea of just really seeing what situations I'm in that give a rise to those.
Right.
Like
what thoughts pass through your mind? What
origination?
Yeah. What memories? What thoughts? What emotions?
Right.
Just whatever is happening in your mind. So that's what I would suggest that you do with them, and I think you'll discover them to be very, very powerful kinds of insight and experiences in themselves. If you're watching the whole. I mean, after all, what you're doing is you're having a direct experience of your body really as a part of something greater, of it not really being of the solid, substantial nature that the model of our body we carry in our mind is. Or you asked me at another time something about, do I think the mind is a prediction machine? I think it's more than that, but I think it absolutely is. And I'm very interested in the cognitive psychology approach to predictive processing. It is a prediction machine. But what we ordinarily experience of the body is is a model that the mind has made. What these kinds of experiences give you an opportunity to do is experiencing your body in a way that is different from that model, experiencing the relationship between your body and your environment and your mind, mental processes, so on and so forth, seeing the whole thing in a much clearer way. So you can use these sensations when they're present as a way of going beyond the models that we carry in our mind, and that is the essence of vipassana, right? So you'll be in a very vipassana-rich state if you just allow yourself to be introspectively and extrospectively aware of these sensations and of what's going on in your mind. And that particular combination is you can use you can use your attention to explore things, and that will be the investigation component of vipassana. It's the seeing into, seeing beyond. It's seeing how actually your mind is constructing all of this. So
this has been a very, I have to admit that there's been a lot of personal insights into my addiction to being efficient and doing things very efficiently, and seeing how much of my behavior it almost compulsively comes out as this seeking of doing things efficiently, and it just, even how much you can see pain arising from it.
Yes.
Thank you for confirming what you've said.
Yeah. You're welcome, and thanks for sharing your experience with us. So, all right, let's see. Next, I have Orhan Karali. Is Orhan with us today? Hey, hi, Orhan. Am I pronouncing your name right?
You are pronouncing it perfectly, Orhan.
Okay, that was just dumb luck, not knowledge. Yeah, all right. So you're asking which type of shamanism did I study, and can we make use of shamanic practices to supplement my TMI efforts in meditation towards non-dual mindset? Yeah, I think that's well, first of all, I studied I studied with Michael Harner, and so what I studied was core shamanism. In other words, you're familiar with Michael Harner?
No, I'm not, but I'm writing it down, so I'll look it up.
Yes. Well, he spent many years as an academic studying shamanic cultures and looking for the common themes in all shamanic cultures. And that's what he called core shamanism. And so then for a number of years, he's been teaching shamanic practices to people, particularly journeying and different ways of using shamanic journeying, what's called soul retrieval, whatever. If you're familiar with these different forms of shamanism, you'll recognize that there are that these are common threads that to one degree or another characterize these shamanic cultures. So we're dealing with beings, we're dealing with another dimension of reality is really what we're dealing with in shamanism. That's what I learned, and I found it incredibly fascinating. It's, it makes you more aware than ever of how you're seeing a world that your mind has constructed due to the cumulative effect of all of your own life experiences and your culture and everything like this. And you realize that you're not, that there are whole worlds that are part of, that are, what's the right word? They're existing simultaneously with this one, and that they can be accessible. One of the things that's very interesting is a common experience in young children is that they will be very much aware of what we might call these alternate realities and beings in these alternate realities. And then as they grow up, they learn that it's not acceptable to have these imaginary beings that you're interacting with in this imaginary world, and that it's time to grow up and see things the way everybody else does. But shamanism is all about going the other way and opening up, and journeying is a very core part of that. You're really interested in how we can use these practices. Well, one of the first thought that came to my mind when you asked that question, I have to ask myself why I didn't think of it until you asked it, or if I had already and just hadn't explicitly recognized it. But it is a powerful way of dealing with the kind of psychological, emotional stuff that comes up in stages 4 and 7, and that I refer to as purifications. Because an important part of shamanism is that it's a way of healing. It's a way of bringing about spiritual and psychological and emotional healing. And I mentioned soul retrieval. I don't know if you're familiar with that, or anybody else is familiar with that. For those that aren't, the theory is that in your interactions with other people, and some of which are very powerful interactions, sometimes what happens is some part of somebody else's soul sticks to us, and at the same time, it goes the other way. And then our interactions with other people, sometimes we lose parts of our soul to the soul of others. I know this is just about as non-Buddhist as you can get, but it really works quite well in a Buddhist framework if you're interested enough to pursue it. But what are we really talking about when we're talking about retrieving those bits of your soul that have come from your experiences that essentially don't belong to you, and that you need to get rid of it? And what do we mean to say that we've lost certain aspects of ourselves? Well, it's very much like what happens as after we're born, we're grown, we have experiences, and every powerful experience we have, every powerful interaction changes us. Well, every even the most minuscule actions and interactions and reactions change us, but they're the big ones that make big changes. And these are the ones where we've either lost something or we've taken on something that in the future manifests in our behavior, in our reaction to things. To some degree, it shapes and molds different aspects of who and what we are. And so shamanism is really, it's all about healing. It's all about dealing with these things. It does it in a ceremonial way, but there's also it is a very, if you're the one that's actually performing the ceremony or doing a journey on someone's behalf or something like this, that when you are doing that, you have entered a very different realm, and you can call upon your mind. Of course, is going to do what it does anyway. It's going to it's going to create formations that correspond to certain kinds of beings. And whoever has taught you shamanism and whatever culture you belong to is going to determine much of the nature of how you see those beings in your mind. They can act as spirit guides. You can call upon these forces to help heal somebody, and this is really the role of a shaman, is to be a healer for the whole tribal group, for any member of it, so on and so forth. And the soul retrieval part of it is a big part of it. Yes, as a matter of fact, I feel like after we finish this session, I should try to get in touch with Michael and say, I just realized you're teaching something that could be used as a very powerful practice within the meditation and Dharma community, because as we're all finding out, and as you'll all be finding out more and more as we go along here, that the forces that shape us can sometimes leave behind things that we really do need to integrate back into the rest of ourselves. They're, whether you metaphorize them as shedding bits of somebody else's soul and recovering bits of your own, it doesn't matter. It's very important that the psychological healing that take place, and just a little bit of something that you've heard from me before. I know I've been on about this for a while now, but it was such a wonderful, when Ken Wilber put this idea out of waking up is not enough, that cleaning up, growing up, and there's also showing up. But most especially cleaning up and growing up are things that have to go along with waking up. But almost no tradition ever deals with all of these things. And Buddhist meditation traditions are outstanding in their ability to guide a person towards waking up without necessarily producing as much growing up and cleaning up as needs to happen. So what I present in The Mind Illuminated is the recognition that these things that other practices will tell you to just, work through, push down, ignore, just focus on the rise and fall, so on. It encourages you to confront them and to see them and understand them. So, but one of the things that I've come to realize in my own experience is that meditation alone, it's the amount of cleaning up that it's going to do is just what's necessary for you to have insight and awaken. And the more insight and awakening you experience, the less likely you are to notice these things, because they make themselves known primarily through dukkha, right? Yeah. Because they're the unawakened parts of yourself. And when you become awakened and you're dwelling in this place where dukkha just passes through you or over you or whatever, you become blind to this. And this is not the same thing as repression or spiritual bypassing or anything else, although somebody who's prone to repression or spiritual bypassing, of course, would, we've seen some wonderful research done by Bill Hamilton, a book he wrote about saints and psychopaths. How often saints are psychopaths. So, it kind of illustrates the fact that it's really important that we put a major emphasis on cleaning up, and I'm very pleased to be able to say in the Mind Illuminated that we've done that, rather than just note it and go back to the rise and fall or whatever other. So go back and stare at the wall a little longer, and so on and so forth. But I realize it's not enough. It's not enough in the sense that, sure, it will facilitate greatly insight and awakening, and I think the Mind Illuminated is a really, really powerful and effective method that it is bringing people to insight and awakening. But it doesn't go far enough. And it's just the nature of what we are, is that there will be parts of our psyche that harbor things that have always been buried, but could potentially have been recognized and dealt with more easily. But as you progress on the paths of awakening, the chances of you recognizing them as something that needs to be purified diminishes. And so, yeah, long answer to your question, Arhan, but I think it's because it's inspired me. Yes, let's look at bringing shamanism into these spiritual paths. Now, it has to be done in the right way, because as we all know, Tibetan Buddhism is really a marriage of Buddhism and the Bonpo, the shamanic system. But in the evolution of that in Tibet, we come up with this awkward situation of a theocracy where the nation consists of impoverished peasants, and that all of the wealth is concentrated in these gilded monasteries with huge tapestries that have actually been created by people living in poverty with crippling arthritis in their hands and fingers as a result, and so on and so forth. It's not, in other words, like anything else, bringing shamanism into Buddhism is not going to be magic, but it has an enormous power, and if it's used in the right way, and that's probably how Tibetan Buddhism, how it was originally used, I would think. But
the journey you introduced us to seems to have a lot of overlap with Tibetan tantric empowerment practices, replacing one set of imprints with the Buddha imprints.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about shamanism, people don't realize, but just like the Tibetan is a mixture, Muslim Sufi tradition is a mixture of Muslim religion with the Turkish shamanism from Central Asia. That's where the mysticism and the unique practices are coming from.
Mm-hmm.
But I really appreciated your answer. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I certainly appreciated your question. Oh, and it's not your only one. I see you have another one after this. In the last 10 years, a number of articles were published on default mode network and task positive network based on fMRI studies during meditation. Do you see validity in the default mode network theories? If so, how can we take advantage of the default mode knowledge, default mode knowledge in our meditative path? Thanks. Okay, very, very interesting question. The default mode network is what produces that inner chatter, that inner self-talk, that ongoing recycling of whatever the things that are currently going on in your life. And of course, when you are performing a task that requires the focus of your attention, the default mode network stops producing the inner chatter. And what they found, of course, is that what they're referring to as the default mode network is one set of neural networks. And what they're referring to as a task mode network as being a different collection of neural networks that is active when you're engaged in a task and when that inner voice is not going on. Now, what we know from experience is that you can be engaged in a task, you can slip into that inner chatter thing, and then your mind will recognize, you'll become aware that it's time to stop that and refocus on the task. But many tasks have that nature. I did woodworking for a lot of years, and you can go into this space where your mind is just talking to itself, the kind of thing that happens to us pretty much continuously, and it's only when we're doing something that it stops. So, but you can be doing a task and be slipping in and out of that. So it's kind of gotten to be this thing of default mode network, bad. Task mode network, well, that's what's happening. That's what has the power to overcome this bad default mode network. And if you think about it, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. It's ludicrous. I mean, you're saying that something as powerful as a default mode network is a useless vestigial thing that we don't even need, sort of like an appendix or, a sixth finger or something like that. I mean, to me, the first time I encountered this, I thought to myself, yeah, something this major is just it's just something that we'd be better off without. If you could just remove it somehow, we'd all be better off. We enjoy that inner silence. But I think what the default mode network, or what's referred to as the default mode network, is a consequence of our awareness deficit disorder and our total domination of experience by attention. By attention and by those parts of the mind associated with attention, that when you're not paying attention to something in particular, they're looking for something to do. And so they're constantly rehashing something that happened yesterday, something you're looking forward to tomorrow, something that you're worried about, something you're afraid of, etc., and so on. Now, I think that that what that really is a part of the whole attentional network that is very important and very valuable, but it should be turned off when you're not using it, and it doesn't have an off switch anymore. Except that this is something that through meditative practice, one of the things that does characterize meditation and the process of insight and achievement of the first stage of awakening is a quieting of the default mode network. That there is an inner silence, and it's an absolutely wonderful thing. But I think what it is, it's the result. I think the essence of awakening is bringing your mind more back into balance, where the balance between awareness and attention as conscious manifestations, there are reflections of an imbalance between what we'll call for convenience, and I'm following Ian McGilchrist here, the right brain and left brain processes. So we're way out of balance. We're left brain dominant in a way that is largely responsible for our suffering and the suffering that we cause other people. And it's something that I believe Yuval Harari has accurately identified as a shift that took place in the species Homo about 70,000 years ago. So it's not a genetic shift, but what we know now, the brain restructures itself. What McGilchrist talks about now is that the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres, which do have a lateralization of function, although, you know, most neuroscientists always want to tell you that there is nothing that is reserved to just one hemisphere. That's absolutely right. There is no process that's reserved to a single hemisphere. Even speech, and in women compared to men, there's more right hemisphere involvement in speech, and I think that's something that if you pay attention to the verbal abilities of men and women, that becomes immediately obvious. There is a difference, and men tend to be more totally left brain when it comes to verbalizations than women do. Guys, that's why we can never win an argument with a woman. So it's hardly even worth trying, and that's one of the things that comes with wisdom. But yeah, if we look at the corpus callosum, that the way it is in modern Homo sapiens, there is a predominance of fibers that go from the left brain to the right brain that are inhibitory in nature. And the brain is in a very plastic state. When you're born, between the time of your birth and about 5 years of age, your brain, essentially, that's when your brain wires itself to become a human brain. That's also when, you know, I think the tabula rasa theory is a bit of an exaggeration, but on the other hand, that is when your brain is most subject to what we would call external influences. In other words, you adopt so much from your caregivers, when your caretakers, when you're an infant, of their views. When we talk to children, what are we doing? We're passing along to them. We talk to babies. We're passing along to them patterns of seeing things, of behaving, of talking, of expressing emotions, all kinds of things. And this is a time when the brain is wiring itself. And I think that what Yuri has identified is the point in time where an accumulation of cultural memes, that's kind of like an accumulation of genes that produces a phenotypical change in an animal. But an accumulation of what we might call memes, cultural memes, became strong enough that over a short period of time, infants growing up in this culture that is dominated by this set of memes, their brains became wired to replicate and perpetuate that. And that's who we are. And that's what our practice is undoing. I think it is rebalancing our brain. And I'm waiting for the day that somebody checks and finds out that there are fewer inhibitory fibers going from left to right in the brain of awakened people. So,
thank you again.
Yeah, so back to the default network, just to finish this up. So it's a necessary and functional part. It just, in this shift to left brain dominance, it and its connection to the verbal centers and things like that, it lost its off switch. It lost its off switch. And it's bad enough that we go around with all this perpetual storytelling in our heads, but it's more than just a nuisance. It's an enormous troublemaker, because one of the things I'm sure that you've noticed as your introspective awareness increases and you notice the kinds of things that are going on in your mind, the kind of self-talk that's occurring, These are the stories that you're living by. This chatter is repeating the stories that, whatever your story happens to be, you know, but this is where it's being generated. You know, I'm not as good as other people for such and such reason, or I have a right to expect everyone around me to hold my interests above anything else, you know. Whatever the story is. As a matter of fact, I love Byron Katie because she kind of deals with this right where it comes into consciousness. What is your story? Where would you be without your story? What if you changed your story? But working backwards again to the default mode network, it's more than this self-talk. If you've noticed, how many of you have noticed this in just observing the nature of your own self-talk, right? It's not good. It's not good. The stories that you're telling yourself, yeah, they're not the best. They're not the best influence to be shaping who you are, but you can reshape them. And that's what happens when part of having part of being a self-craving awakening is. It's the shifting of your inner story in a positive direction. So now you can start telling yourself stories. You can commentate on your meditations, and you can talk to yourself about how much better you are, and how much better you feel, and how much better you get along with people since you've been meditating. And oh, this meditation is really wonderful, and so on and so forth. Those are really good stories. Of course, there's the bad stories too. There's how come I'm not already an arhat, or whatever other version of bad story you can associate with meditation. But we part of what we're doing is learning to tell ourselves a better kind of story, and that's a really good way to use the default mode network while you've got one, while it's still something that's going to be telling stories and that hasn't disappeared. Some people, especially one of the biggest problems I think with this whole default mode network theory is it's created the idea that we want to get rid of it and it's not a good thing. And the goal of our practice is to make it disappear. Well, the disappearance of it, there's other ways that you can make it disappear other than being awakened. And the disappearance of it is not a cause or a part or of awakening. It's a side effect. It's a side effect of, I mean, if awakening represents moving more to a right brain awareness, especially the mindful awareness that we call sati sampajana, then that, yes, that's the direction we're trying to move to, and the default mode network can play a role before it disappears. It can play a positive role. You can declare yourself a bodhisattva. You can decide to practice compassion. You can decide to practice, you can start telling different kinds of stories about yourself. This is actually very closely related to the way the Buddha took the word karma, which literally means action, and in the Buddha's day had come to mean action with moral consequences. And the Buddha saw that it wasn't what happened to you because what you did, that it was really, I mean, that is something that is just plain old causality. Like you go around, you're being a good person, people are going to treat you well. You go around being an asshole, and people are not going to treat you so well. There's just plain old causality. But he said, when I say karma, I mean intent, because behind every action is an intention, and that's what's important, is what's behind the action. And the important thing is, if that intention is driven by craving and self-clinging, then it's shaping you in a really bad way. And if it's not, then it's shaping you differently. And the same thing is true of the default mode network. It's telling your story. So the goal isn't to get rid of it. It will go away. You don't need to make it go away. It'll go away on its own, but make good use of it while you have it. You know, take bodhisattva vows, or take vows of any kind. Redefine how you think of yourself. Observe your behavior mindfully and recognize when you're being unskillful and unmindful. And let those be the stories that your default mode network recycles like an idling engine that doesn't have a job to do, so it just recycles whatever keeps running the same stuff, that whatever happens to be near enough by for the machine to crank away on. Give it some good stuff to crank away on. That's a good use of the default mode network. Eventually you come to a place where there's an off switch. So you still have a default node network, and it's still doing a really important job anytime you have a task to perform that involves focused attention and verbal processing or logical processing or these other kinds of things that the default mode network is designed to do. So how's that for an answer?
Using the default mode network for positive reinforcements for rewiring our brain wasn't an answer I expected. And again, I am just blown away by your wisdom. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, think about, the word just slipped out of my mind. That's the trouble with being 74. What is it when you have some positive statement that you repeat to yourself? You know what I mean?
Affirmation.
Affirmations, yes. Why on earth would repeating affirmations? Yeah, I mean, can you see the connection? And as a matter of fact, think about chanting mantras and the role of mantras, and even the extensive use of mantras in Tibetan Buddhism, where they're a part of the tantric practice of generation, where you're doing your deity practices and things like that. This is all related. The chanting of a mantra. I mean, a mantra can be a meaningless sound, but a more powerful mantra is one that has meaning, and you know the meaning, and the meaning is there whenever Om Mani Padme Hum, or whatever it is that you're doing. Om Ahum Vajagur Penasiddhi Hum, or Tara Tutara Tara Yasoha. Anyway, if you know what these things mean, if you know what they're referring to, then you're doing more than just repeating some sounds. However, just repeating some sounds, I won't take anything away from that either. But it's like affirmations. Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's now been an hour and a half. Is Michael Walsh here? No. And Jennifer Waldman? No. How about Paul Rodriguez?
Yeah, I'm here.
You're here. Okay, great. We'll stretch this out a little further because you're here and you have a question and I want to deal with it. Okay? Is that all right with everyone? You can leave if you want. I won't mind. I won't be insulted. Okay, so I'm curious about references in the suttas to the cessation of consciousness. I was reading Analayo's recently about Tana, and he stated that when passion for the aggregates is overcome, consciousness becomes unestablished and final liberation will be attained. I did some online research which revealed that the idea of cessation may be an errant translation of Nirodha. Am I confusing the term unestablished by equating it with cessation? Can you speak to both of these ideas? I don't recognize the Pali word that that you're saying is being translated as unestablished. And is this Analio? So this is going to be one of the Pali Suttas. Okay. So yes. So when passion for the aggregates is overcome, consciousness becomes unestablished and final liberation will be attained. First of all, let me just acknowledge that that I'm not familiar with the use of the word unestablished. I don't know what the Pali equivalent, it's not in my vocabulary. And I really enjoy Analio's work, but I haven't read the one that he's made this particular reference. But Nirodha and Nirvana have very similar meanings. And both of them are implying, but in different ways, something that I think to translate in English as cessation is, I believe that that's a reasonable translation for both nirvana and nirodha. And nirodha has retained its meaning as like the word cessation. Okay, something undergoes sensation, or something that ceases, right? And so it's a descriptive term that has some kind of object that it's describing. Whereas what's happened with nirvana, which means to extinguish or to be extinguished, it also is a descriptive term, and it requires by itself to be combined with some kind of specification of what it is that's extinguished. What is the extinguishing of a candle flame an analogy to? And so I'm really comfortable with the word cessation. Like I say, I don't know what unestablished means in this context, but cessation, nirodha, and nirvana as all referring to something that ceases to occur, either temporarily or in some cases permanently. So, for example, the Buddha spoke of the nirvana of craving, and the nirvana that was the cessation of dukkha and craving and self-clinging. And then there's this other cessation, this much more powerful cessation, this nirodha, or cessation of all mental formations. Now, there's a distinction made between two kinds of nirvana, two kinds of extinctions, two kinds of cessations. Once again, I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm trying to just see if I can figure out how unestablished relates to this. And actually, I think I'm catching the thread of it, and we'll have to check do a little scholarly work to see if I've got it. But yeah, we can apply these cessations to many things, and there's a total cessation that Nirodha Samapatti refers to that is considered to be equivalent to death. So there is the cessation that people associate with the nirvana of all mental formations, and a big deal has come to be made of that kind of cessation as an important event in the awakening process. And the extreme form of that is the Nirodha Samapatti, which according to I've never practiced Nirodha Samapatti, but apparently it's something that you go into this sort of stasis, and it typically can last for a week or longer. And as they say, the only difference between this particular nirvana of the Nirodha Samapatti and the pari-nibbana of death is that there is still warmth in the body. The body temperature falls dramatically in the Nirodha Samapatti, but there's still warmth. And that's, of course, in the people of those times, they didn't have EEGs and EKGs and things like that. So there's a lot of, who knows what state of the body was in. I think Nirodha Samapatti is a state that's very similar to what these yogis go into when, they're buried underground for a week, things like that, and then dug up and they're still alive. Very powerful cessation. So there's a lot of different cessations. But what is the nirvana? What is the cessation that the Buddha is spoken of as dwelling in nirvana? But the mind of Buddha dwells in nirvana, while the speech and action of the Buddha dwells in the marketplace, meaning that he was walking around teaching, collecting alms, and things like this. So the nirvana that's being referred to here is the extinction of self-clinging, craving, and dukkha. Right? Now let's see if just make one stab here at. He stated that when passion for the aggregates is overcome and consciousness becomes unestablished, and final liberation will be attained. Now, the cessation of consciousness is essentially what the nirvana of mental formations is. It's essentially consciousness without an object, right? And you can't have consciousness without an object, so it's a cessation of consciousness. But it can make an imprint on your memory, and you can recall it afterwards as a cessation event, or as consciousness without an object. Okay, I think the closest that I can come to this is that the unestablished, what's referring to as consciousness becomes unestablished. I think but this is my guess, could be totally off the wall, but this is my guess, is that it's referring to that state of consciousness that the Buddha described as, in the seeing is only the seeing, and in the walking is only the walking, and the hearing is only the hearing, and thinking is only the thinking. So there's consciousness, but the consciousness is unestablished in any sense of a self as an actor or even observer. So that's going to be my guess about the consciousness becoming unestablished in self and craving and everything else that flows out of that, and that is the liberation, of course, that is the final liberation. Yeah, I guess what slowed me down a little bit with that was final liberation, because the final liberation is what happens at death. That's of all the nirvanas, that's the one that has the label pari, which means it means beyond, it means ultimate, it means the most. So the most nirvana you can have is the death of the body, and that and the Nirodha Samapatti are known as nirvana without remainder, quite appropriate, right? And all other nirvanas are nirvana with remainder, and we know what that remainder is, right? It's those characteristics of suffering and craving and self-clinging that are gradually unwound through the process of traversing the four paths. So there's my guess. It'll be fun to see what you find out if you pursue the Pali meaning. But anyway, I got to say something I felt was worth saying, even if it turns out that it's from a scholastic point of view is incorrect. So, okay, well, it's been fun. I really enjoyed it. I'm sorry that we got off to a little problematic start there. And it seems like we did answer the questions of everybody that was here, which is always my number one goal. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this, and look forward to talking to you again.